Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring this idea of freedom, like what it actually means and whether we truly have it. We're diving into this podcast episode titled The Illusion of Freedom. Are we truly free for this one?
Oh, that's a fascinating topic, and maybe a little ironic, considering we're exploring it all within this pre-recorded episode.
Right, kind of like questioning the recipe when you're already like halfway through baking the cake.
Exactly.
But that irony, it actually kind of underscores the point, right? Like freedom is rarely absolute.
It really is. It's more like a spectrum, kind of this constant interplay between, constraints and choices.
Yeah.
But to really, understand all that, we kind of have to define what freedom even is first.
Well, the podcast we're looking at starts with a pretty simple definition. Freedom is the ability to act, think, or speak without restrictions. But then it gets really interesting because they point out that even places where we supposedly have, like freedom of speech, there can be pretty serious consequences for what we say.
Oh, absolutely. Think about whistleblowers, right? They often face legal issues or get totally ostracized just for speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
It just shows how freedom is never really black and white.
So even the most basic freedoms, like speech, they have limits. And that makes me think about all the other ways our freedom is shaped by forces outside of ourselves. Things like the political system, economic realities, even technology these days.
You're hitting on a key point there. The podcast host really emphasizes how, for example, economic disparity impacts someone's freedom. They use this very powerful example. A billionaire has so much more freedom to explore different opportunities than someone who's just, struggling to make ends meet.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
If you're constantly worried about just putting food on the table,
Yeah.
your freedom to chase your passions or even take risks is it's limited.
Oh, yeah.
And I imagine that resonates with a lot of people out there, especially with how things are going right now.
It does. It's a very real constraint that many people are grappling with. But, even beyond those economic realities, there's the influence of technology, too.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Especially with algorithms and that whole filter bubble effect.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're being subtly steered towards certain information and choices without even realizing it.
Exactly. And that brings up a pretty interesting question. Do you really feel free when your whole online experience, from what you read to what you buy, is being shaped by, algorithms that you have no control over?
It's kind of unsettling when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
You start to wonder who's really making the decisions.
Yeah.
But then there's another layer to this, something the podcast host calls the panopticon effect.
Ah, yes. That's a fascinating concept. Imagine this prison where the guards can see all the prisoners, but the prisoners can't see the guards.
Oh, wow. So they never know if they're being watched.
Exactly. And because of that, they're constantly self-regulating their behavior.
That's kind of creepy.
The podcast argues that this is happening to us today with all the surveillance tech all around us. Cameras everywhere, data collection, social media monitoring, it all creates that same kind of effect.
So it's like we're living in a digital panopticon.
Yeah, pretty much.
Huh. It makes you think, do we censor our own thoughts and actions just because we feel like we're constantly being watched?
It's definitely something to think about, and it really shows how just the perception of being observed can impact our sense of freedom.
So we've got these external pressures,
Mm-hmm.
economics, technologies, surveillance, all subtly shaping our choices. But it's not just the outside world limiting us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our own minds can be pretty powerful obstacles to freedom.
Absolutely. The podcast explores that side of things as well, all the internal constraints that we put on ourselves. And those can be even more sneaky because we might not even realize they're holding us back. One of the most common internal constraints is just plain old fear.
Oh, yeah. I could definitely relate to that. Fear of failure or what people will think, or even just fear of the unknown. Those have definitely stopped me from doing things in the past.
Fear is a powerful thing, isn't it? It can make us stick to what's comfortable, stop us from going after what we want, and even just make us stay quiet when we really have something to say.
Yeah, it's like we build these walls around ourselves without even realizing it. But fear's not the only thing holding us back from the inside, is it? The podcast also mentioned how much conditioning plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Conditioning is huge. It's how our families, our education, our culture, even the stuff we watch and listen to, it all shapes what we think is possible, what we think is okay, even who we think we're supposed to be.
Right. Like we get handed this script about our lives that we didn't even write.
Precisely. And those scripts, they can be really limiting. Even if we don't realize we're following them, they can stop us from challenging the way things are, or even just from imagining something different for ourselves.
Makes you wonder, how much of what we believe is really ours? And how much is just stuff we picked up along the way?
That's a really deep question. And it kind of highlights how important it is to, like, look at what we believe, question our assumptions, and just see if any of that is keeping us from being as free as we could be.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
But even if we do break free from those old scripts, we still have to deal with our own biases, right? Like that confirmation bias the podcast talked about. The way we tend to look for stuff that backs up what we already think.
Confirmation bias is everywhere. And it can really get in the way of thinking freely. It's how we end up in those echo chambers where we're just surrounded by people who agree with us, and then we never really have to think critically or consider other points of view.
Yeah, I've totally been there, especially with social media. It's so easy to create a feed that only shows you what you want to see, you know, and then it just reinforces everything you already think and makes you less open to new ideas.
It is. It's like we're building our own little information bubbles, which doesn't really help us see the bigger picture. It just keeps us stuck in one way of thinking.
We're basically building mental prisons, one like or follow at a time.
Huh. That's a great way to put it. And it just goes to show how crucial it is to actively seek out different perspectives, challenge our own assumptions, and be open to having our beliefs challenged. That's what real intellectual freedom is all about.
I think you're right. And then, of course, there's addiction, which the podcast mentioned as another thing that limits our freedom from within.
Addiction is a big one, and it's not just about substances, right? It could be anything. Technology, needing other people's approval, even being stuck in routines. But basically, addiction means you need something, you depend on it, and that makes it harder to make choices freely.
Like you're tied to something and can't really explore other options.
Exactly. Your whole focus is on getting that thing you're addicted to, and that doesn't leave much room for making your own decisions or pursuing anything else.
That's a good point. And then there's the internal constraint that I think a lot of people don't talk about, mental health. The podcast touched on how anxiety, depression, or trauma can really impact our sense of freedom.
Mental health is so important for our overall well-being, and that includes our feeling of being free. When we're dealing with those kinds of things, our own thoughts and feelings can feel like a cage. It's like they block us from seeing possibilities, making choices, and actually doing something about it.
Our own minds become the bars holding us in.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And to break free from that, it often takes getting professional help, finding ways to cope, and being kind to ourselves through the process.
So we've explored these pressures from the outside world and all the internal struggles that can shape our experience of freedom. It's pretty complicated, huh?
It really is. And it brings us to that big question.
Yeah.
Can we ever truly be free with all these things working against us?
That is the question, isn't it? Like, can we ever be truly free? The podcast host spends some time on that, bringing in different ideas from philosophy. It's like a whole buffet of thoughts about freedom.
It really is. And I like how they didn't try to make it simple. They start with the existentialists, who have a pretty, maybe a dark view on this.
Dark how view.
Well, they're saying even though we can make choices, we're still basically stuck with the circumstances we're born into, our families, how society's set up, even our own bodies.
So it's like we're playing this game where someone else made up all the rules.
Exactly. And for the existentialists, true freedom would mean you get to pick the rules of the game, which they don't think is possible at all.
Okay, so not exactly a happy thought.
Yeah.
What are some other ways of looking at it?
Well, on the totally opposite side, there's the Buddhist idea, which is more about freedom inside yourself.
Internal freedom.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Buddhists believe true freedom comes from letting go of, well, attachments. Like not being so tied to your stuff or getting specific results, even your own desires. They think clinging to all that just causes suffering and holds you back.
So it's like detaching from all those things we think we need to be happy.
Right. By letting go of that stuff, you're free from all the worry and disappointment that comes from trying to control everything. It's kind of like freedom through surrendering, in a way.
That's an interesting idea. So we've got existentialists saying true freedom's impossible, and Buddhists saying it's about letting go of pretty much everything. Any other takes on this?
The podcast also mentions a more, I guess, social or political view of freedom. The idea that the most freedom for everyone comes from making systems that are fairer and more equal.
So it's not so much about each person being free, but more like everyone together.
Yeah, kinda. Think of it like this. If everybody has their basic needs met, plus opportunities and the same chances, then within that system, everyone has more individual freedom.
So like designing the game so the rules are fair and anyone has a shot at winning.
Exactly. But that also brings up this constant tension between what one person's free to do versus what's good for the whole group.
Man, so many ways to think about freedom. It's a lot to take in. But in the end, is it even possible to be truly free?
That's the question we all keep coming back to, right? The podcast host kind of suggests that maybe it's not about reaching this perfect state where you're totally free. Maybe it's more like a process.
So freedom's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. It's about knowing the limits that are there, both from the outside world and from within ourselves, and then figuring out how to move through them. It's about making choices that match our values and goals, even with those limits in place.
That's actually pretty empowering when you think about it. Even if we can't be totally free, we can still try to have more control over our lives and make choices that really matter to us.
I think that's a great point. Just because we know there are limits doesn't mean we should feel defeated. It can actually help us be more deliberate about the choices we make, make them more meaningful.
So to wrap this up, what are the main things our listeners should remember from this deep dive?
First, freedom's not black and white. It's a spectrum, this back and forth between what we're limited by and what choices we get to make.
And it's affected by things outside us, like the economy, technology, even whether we're being watched or not. Plus, stuff going on inside each of us, like fear, how we were raised, and even our own biases.
We also saw there's a bunch of different ways philosophers think about freedom, some pretty pessimistic, some more about finding that inner peace.
But maybe the biggest takeaway is this. Freedom isn't something you just achieve and that's it. It's more like an ongoing journey where we figure out what our limitations are, inside and out, and then work with them as best we can.
That's a great way to put it. And when we get that, we stop being just swept along by whatever happens, and we start making things happen for ourselves. We become more active in creating our own freedom, whatever that looks like for us.
Well said. So to our listeners, as you keep going on your own journeys, I want you to think about this. What limitations are you ready to challenge? What choices can you make to create your own version of freedom? Keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember the path to freedom is yours to create.